Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Superman and Lois. So, for some reason that this episode was delayed, I thought it was kind of funny when I was watching HBO Max and then all of a sudden I saw Superman and Lois on HBO Max. I'm like, I'm sorry, that is not going to be a selling factor for somebody to be like, oh my god, Superman and Lois is now on HBO Max? I need to now subscribe to HBO Max to get Superman and Lois, when I could have gone into the CW app and got it for free. Weird decision. But anyways, I feel like really the CW app is probably going to be sucked into and transitioned into HBO Max. I'm assuming it's probably just a matter of time. Because reasonably, it's like, well, this app is for free, and how about we just like take all this content that we're giving people for free and then just put it on a pre-existing app and then just justify like, well, hey, now you can get all the flashes and the whatever shows that like is exclusively on this app, because we now have to just justify like this app and have a library of shows that aren't getting any kind of money for. And plus, really, Warner Brothers is, I think, just desperate to just get money at this point from people, no matter what, in all brutal honesty. Because really, Zack Snyder's Justice League probably didn't open up their wallets and throw cash in it to an enough. So, within this episode, I feel that we have some people that didn't matter in previous episodes now matter in this episode. We end up actually having Lois Lane actually having something of a story that I'm actually interested about. Because really, Lois Lane's character is just kind of a character that is just there, but I don't care. With this episode, I actually was invested in actually Lois Lane's story. I honestly think that they should figure out something for both Superman and Lois to do together, because they're the title screen name. They're the title screen name, and how many times do they never do stuff with one another? Superman is so tied up with his sons, it's ridiculous. They should have honestly called this show Superman and Sons, because that would have made a lot more sense, because really, this entire show is basically catered around Jordan and Jonathan, and then everything else is just an afterthought. To where it's like, oh, I guess we should probably do Superman in here, right? Yeah, we probably should, because Jordan can't actually have the actual powers of taking this guy down himself. Or taking this person down or whatever. Jordan doesn't have the ability to do these things. Really, we have it within this episode that it seems that Jordan is going through some power side effects, and eventually within this episode we have to figure out what that is. That seems to be the main thing going on into this episode, but we end up also having a villain returning within this episode as well. So it's like, oh man, so I guess it really is trying to tell us that, like, hey guys, if you haven't seen these episodes in a while, go on a recap, because you're going to have to really reconfirm some things. But it seems that also we have some interesting things going on where we have it to where Jordan within this episode is really starting to find out what being a person with superpowers really means in this episode. And we end up having it to where it seems that Jordan can't exactly be honest with everyone, to where he has to kind of fabricate or make up a story so that way he can try and hide things. We end up having Jonathan, who ends up basically feeling the real burden of being with a brother with superpowers. We end up having Jonathan, who's like, well, yeah, you know what? Like, maybe we should actually talk to Dad about this. Like, we end up having it to where Jonathan is really kind of thinking differently than Jordan is, because Jordan is just like, well, yeah, like, let me just get by, and I think that I'll be fine. Where Jonathan is like, no, I think that this is, like, something serious, and I think that you should really go and, like, so we have an episode full of that, where eventually we end up having it to where Jonathan really gets the burden of watching over Jonathan, but on top of that, we eventually have it to where Jonathan, his life consistently gets ruined because of someone in this family uh, just making Jonathan try to do the right thing. And so within this episode, we'll see what that is. But other than that, yeah, we really have we have some interesting sequences with Superman in this episode, but reasonably we end up having mostly just a CGI thing going on with Superman in this episode. We eventually have it to where it seems that Superman's story is that he eventually ends up fighting with Sam in this episode, Sam Lane. It seems like those two are kind of butting heads in this episode, and that kind of makes for a very fascinating episode. But yeah, so really, I think that's all that I wanted to say in very much spoiler terms of this episode. Really just kind of a fun episode, kind of coming back to this. But I would just say, like, okay, kind of getting tired with having to have this entire show carried on Superman's sons rather than the couple themselves. Like, I think it's time now to have an entire episode that is just having Superman and Lois. Kind of tired of having this entire show being carried by Jordan and Jonathan. It kind of is getting annoying at this point. But let me pause here for a second. Okay. I think now is about around the time that we go into spoilers about this episode. So, let's go into that double five. To otherwise say it's about that time yet again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time, it's about that time I'm going to spoil this episode. So, because I think I kind of finished up my thoughts and whichever. So, let's focus on Lois first, because she's probably the most... there's lesser things going on with her than there is with anyone else in this episode. So, we end up having Lois, who is to try and find out what Morgan Edge is doing in these caves. It seems that Morgan Edge is planning something of where he's trying to mine for a specific thing. So we end up having Lois, who's trying to figure out what are they doing within these mines. What are they trying to dig up? And so we end up having Lois desperately wanting to get some kind of pass or some kind of inspector's pass to try to figure out what they're doing. And so we end up having it to where it seems, since Lois is interested in something, Captain Luthor or Lex Luthor is also interested in it as well. We end up having it to where also Luthor was trying to get a way to find kryptonite anyways. So we end up having it to where really for Captain Luthor, this is kind of working in his wheelhouse, because he's like, dude, I wanted to find kryptonite anyways, and now I'm finding it with Lois. Like, it's kind of like a win-win for him. So we end up having Lois, who ends up going along with Luthor, but she doesn't still know it's Luthor yet. Like, she's still going by this other name that he had given her. So we end up having Lois going with Luthor to go into these caves to find out that it's kryptonite, and it seems that they end up getting attacked along the way by one of Morgan Edge's assistants. It seems that we end up finding one of his... I don't remember what the girl's name is. I don't remember what his assistant's name is, but we end up finding out that it seems that this woman has Superman-like powers. We end up finding out that she has, like, laser vision, and we end up having eventually Luthor having some kind of weaponry of his own, some kind of future tech. And so we end up having Luthor busting that out to try and take down this woman, and they end up getting away. We end up having Lois, who's very suspicious of Luthor, and is like, you know what, I don't think you are who you say you are, and how is it that you have the tech that you have? There's something about you that doesn't sit well with me, and I gotta figure what that is. So we have that story going on, and so now we have to transition back into what is the key episode for this episode. So in the very beginning of this episode, we end up having Jordan, who is to be by himself alone, taken by Tag. A lot of people might have remembered Tag, who was the kid who would consistently shake all the time, and almost he would have like flash-like power. We seemingly end up finding out that it seems that Tag had gotten loose or had escaped from wherever he was at. I don't think that is quite clear of what actually happened with Tag within this episode. I really think that quite possibly what is actually happening is Sam Lane is actually orchestrating these people with superpowers to try to go against Superman without him really and truly knowing. Because why is it that Sam Lane was so quick to go and say, well, we need to assassinate Tag. We need to kill him. Like, we are not going to ask questions. We're going to just shoot first. And so we end up having it to where Tag is grabbing Jordan, and we end up having Jordan who ends up releasing the signal to call for his father. And so we end up having Superman show up. We end up having, of course, Superman asking Jordan if he's okay. And then we end up having Tag, who ends up running off alongside a train, and Superman follows him. This is a kind of cool event that happens here, but of course it's all with CGI, so it's just kind of like, meh. So we end up finding out that Tag ends up running through the train tracks, and ends up ruining the train tracks, to where we end up having Clark, who ends up having to push up this train to try and fix the tracks to where this train can, of course, function yet again onto these railroad tracks. So we end up, like, it's kind of like the old-fashioned Superman movie, where we end up having Superman who, there's a gap in between the thing of the train, and so we end up having Superman who, like, displays his body so that way the train can go over him. It's kind of like that old trick. But with this one, we end up having Superman using his laser beam vision to try and correct this train. I don't know what it is with Superman and trains, but it always is that way. But anyways, so going along into here, so we end up having it to where Sam Lane is to realize that Tag is out. And so we end up having it to where Sam is immediately just like, Tag is now a threat. We need to eliminate that threat. And Clark is like, no, like, we just need to talk him down. We just need to reason with him. Like, we just need to, like, figure out, like what he needs and help him. But Sam's like, no, like, he grabbed Jordan. He killed my grandson. Like, he's dead to me. And we have it to where Clark is like, no, like, come on. Like, this kid could be, like this kid could eventually be one of the good guys. Like, he just needs to, like, be set straight, kind of thing. He needs to, like, they need to figure out how to, like, talk to him and do some more talking. So we go along in this episode, and so we end up having it to where, bizarrely, we end up having Jordan, who seems to be hearing consistently this ringing in his head, to where it seems that eventually the more and more he hears this ringing in his head, we end up having it to where it seems that he's having troubles controlling his heat vision, to where we really have it to where Jordan is trying as much as possible to delay him just blasting away his heat vision. So we eventually have it to where Jordan is consistently hearing this ringing, and it's really bothering him. And so we end up having Jordan just mention that like he's just getting like headaches or migraines or whatever, and we end up having it to where like Superman is like, oh, okay, so like he's just like he's just going through some troubles. But it seems that we end up having Jordan, who is even having problems like being able to do a number of things on the football field because his headaches are so bad. Um, but anyways, we end up having it to where it seems that Smallville is going up against the Metropolis football team. And so really we have it to where Jonathan and Jordan are like, yeah, we really want to like go to this game and beat these guys because we are really wanting to take them down. We end up having it to where Superman has to ask Jordan like if he feels completely okay. And we end up having Jordan saying like, "Well, yeah, like I'm fine," and we end up having it to where like Superman is like, "I don't think that you're 100%. I'm going to have to like test you to see that if you're 100% perfectly fine." And so we really just have it to where Jordan has to go and punch a log to showcase if he's really fine or not. What? Like that's the test? Like I like we really have it to where eventually like Jordan is to eventually use this punch thing eventually somewhere later along within this episode, but still I thought that was kind of like how is it that that Superman could tell if his son is fine or not by punching a log? Okay, sure. I didn't quite understand what that was, but I think it was just a moment to just be like, hey, this looks cool, so let's do this. And plus, like it was kind of funny when Jordan first tries to punch the log and hurts his hand, but then eventually he ends up punching it the right way because Clark has to mentor him about how to still use his powers. So we have it to where eventually we end up having Morgan Edge, who is talking to Lana Lang and her husband, and mentioning how Morgan Edge believes that Lana could be the real true voice of this town. And so we end up having Morgan Edge, who is trying to root for Lana to become this seemingly political figure of sorts. And we end up having it to a reasonably, I think, Lana Lang's husband, who is Kyle, he's kind of like, I think he is kind of jealous of Lana because I think like Kyle could quite possibly think that like he's the butt buddy of Morgan Edge. Like they're like, ooh, like I thought I was your number one, Morgan Edge. But it would be kind of interesting to see what happens between Morgan Edge and Lana, like following this. But then eventually, when we end up having Lana Lang or Lois Lang, who ends up going to Lana and mention about the Kryptonite Cave or whatever, the Kryptonite Mine, we end up having Lana who's like, like it seems that Morgan Edge is hiding something from us. Like, hey, like if you ever find anything or if you ever like if you ever want me to like help you out, like I really am ready and willing to go and help you. So it seems like Lana is playing the fence here, where it seems that Lana is gonna quite possibly do something that is in her best interest, which that'll maybe be a fairly interesting story somewhere down the road. But like I think Lana is honestly trying to be a double agent here, where it's like, oh well, Lois is saying that Morgan Edge is doing something wrong. Well, like I guess I should take her word for it, because I honestly think that anyone that is actually tied to Superman like wins Lana over. We end up having it to where there's got to be a reason why really very much I would say that Lana's daughter is taking a liking to Jordan, Sarah. There's got to be a reason why Lana just kind of does a double take whenever Superman is around. She's like, kind of thing, because really, Lana probably is very reminiscent of the fact that she didn't get Clark when he was there, and is left with Kyle. Who knows? And plus, really, she could play to the fact that maybe Clark is really a good guy, where Kyle is, I don't know. So we end up having Jordan Jonathan having to deal with Jordan's superpowers. It seems that Jordan is going eventually with, or Jonathan is going with Jordan to the bathroom at some point, because we really have it to where Jordan is having a lot of problems controlling his heat vision. Jonathan notices that and rushes him to the bathroom to where they can just kind of hide out. So we end up having Jonathan, who ends up telling Jordan that he should tell Dad about what's going on. I'm like, shouldn't have Clark have eavesdropped again for the millionth time and just be like, oh my god, my son, his powers are getting out of control, I need to protect him. Because it seems like we end up having, when eventually we get to the game, we end up having Clark, who ends up going out of his way to tell Jordan, like, hey man, like, straighten up and fly right, come on, like, if anything, like, keep your powers in check. So we end up going along, and so we end up going to the Metropolis Smallville game. So we have it to where, again, like I said, we end up having Clark, who is like doing a Jonathan coaching thing off to the sidelines here. And so we end up having it to where, my hair's a little messed up. We end up having it to where Clark is watching over Jonathan and seeing what he is doing. We end up having, at some point, Jordan is to have missed a block because his head is having some issues. He is hearing the whistling again. And so we end up having it to where it seems that eventually we end up having Jordan eventually going and tackling someone, and we end up having Clark, who's like, whoa, like, that doesn't seem that doesn't seem quite right. That doesn't seem like Jordan. And so we end up having Clark reining Jordan in to just tell him, like, hey, get your powers in check. So he doesn't look far too good, or that he doesn't hurt anyone. So we end up having it to where eventually we end up having a fight to break out between all the football players. And eventually we end up having Jordan, who is down on the ground. We end up having Clark, who ends up running to Jordan to have Jordan tell Clark that his laser vision is getting out of control, and that he needs to be able to release his laser vision. And so we end up having Clark, who ends up putting his hand into Jordan's helmet and saying, dude, just do it. Just use it. And so we end up having Jordan, who ends up lasering Superman's fist with his heat vision. And so we end up having it to where really Clark is kind of like going in and kind of like considering that Jordan's powers weren't up, like, were kind of suspicious, and that Jordan wasn't talking to Clark about it, and like he should have. And we have it to where reasonably Jordan is mentioning, it's like, well, like, the way my powers are and the way that your powers are, like, we're from two completely different kinds of worlds. Like, this is completely different between you and me. And we end up having it to where Clark is like, eventually somewhere down the road in this episode, we end up having it to where Clark is like, no, like, me and you are exactly the same. We deal with powers the exact same way. You just don't realize that. And so we end up having eventually that Clark had to realize, like, within this episode, that eventually he wants to use his powers out of anger, but he decides not to, because it only takes one time for people to second guess what to do with Superman in this world. And that kind of makes for just a very interesting story uh, for Superman in this aspect. So we go along and we end up having it to where Jonathan is to mention to Clark that's, hey, I saw him have a episode before this. Like, I saw him have a problem with his powers before this, and so like I'm gonna speak up now because I think it's the right thing to do. And then Clark is just like, Jordan, like, why aren't you telling me these things? Like, I'm here to protect you. Like, I'm here to help you adjust with these powers. It's very difficult to like maintain all of this and be able to like keep it all in check at one time. Um, but yeah, we end up having it to where eventually Superman has to leave because eventually he ends up having to scramble to go off and try to help out Lois because eventually he's getting some things going on with Lois, I think, at this time. Or no, wait. Tag. Tag. We end up having something going on with Tag, I believe, where Superman has to be pulled away from because we end up having it to where Tag is is uh, is kidnapping Sarah, and so we end up having Clark Quest to forcibly go and find Sarah and try to save her from Tag. There we go. I was like, what's going on? So we end up having Jordan and Jonathan who end up going out to a get together with the rest of their team to eventually have them be face to face with the Metropolis team. And so we end up having seemingly both the Smallville and the Metropolis characters eventually really treating one another like crap. We end up having it to where the Metropolis guys were kind of ragging on Jordan and Jonathan before this game was to come up because, of course, that's where they were going to school before all of this. So we end up having it to where we have it to where the Metropolis guys are eventually pushing Jordan a little too far, and we end up having, of course, Jordan who ends up going and doing exactly what his father had taught him earlier. And so we end up having Jordan who ends up going and punching tries to punch one of these Metropolis guys, and Jordan realizing that or Jonathan realizing that Jordan is using his full-on superpower, we end up having Jonathan who puts his hand in the way of Jordan punching this guy in the face and quite possibly killing him. Like, it's probably as powerful as a bullet to the face. So we end up having Jonathan who ends up putting his fist up against Jordan, and we end up having Jordan breaking Jonathan's hand to where now he can no longer play football for the rest of the season. And we end up having to where Jonathan is yet again going like, God, like, I may never play football again. Like, Jordan is basically costing me, like, everything to the point of him now even costing me being able to play football. Where am I going to get a scholarship? Who's going to care about me now? So, because really, football for Jonathan is like his whole life. And then on top of that, like, Jonathan was the guy that was actually doing football. Jordan just tagged along to where it's just like, man, like, if Jordan was not there, if Jordan did not do football, then Jonathan would not have gotten injured. So Jonathan would have been perfectly fine to continue to do football, and he would have actually been the starting quarterback because in an earlier part of the show, we ended up having the Smallville quarterback ended up getting injured, so Jonathan had to go in there to run the plays. So going in here, so we end up having Superman who ends up going after Tag. And so we end up having it to where it seems that eventually Sam Lane figures out where Tag is as well. And so we end up having it to where Superman and Tag they're trying to like fight one another, and eventually Sam Lane's guys come in and they immediately use live rounds, real bullets on Tag and Superman. To where eventually, luckily, we end up having like Superman almost pretty much like trying to protect Tag. Not only that, having to like try to protect Sarah because like they're kind of like innocents in this whole thing. So we eventually end up finding out that Superman is to start to realize that this army not only has live rounds, but then they also have kryptonite bullets. To where even more, like, Superman is just like, wow, like, so you're taking this person that you see as an absolute threat and you want to murder him just because he has superpowers and you don't. But on top of that, you guys have made weapons to try and kill me. To where we just see it to where Superman is just ticked at this point. To where eventually we end up having Superman not only angry at the military force, but we end up having Superman going out of his way to eventually have Sarah and everybody kind of like retrieve to where they were like back to. But we end up having Clark going and talking to Sam Lane about like, hey man, like, I don't quite understand what you're doing here. Like, I can't believe that you are taking every single one of these superpowered people and wanting to just kill them off. Like, there is no reason why every single superhero should now just have a death sentence. This makes no sense. And so we end up having it to where like Sam Lane is just seeing like, well, like all these characters were a threat, and so now I'm having to deal with them. Like that's what we're doing now. And so Clark is just like, oh, okay, all right, well, we'll see how well that goes for you, considering you have like Superman who is basically against you now. And so we end up having just two sides of the different coin, to where it's like we have Clark who wants to reason with things, and Sam Lane is just like, well, just because like this thing is just like quite possibly going to kill something off, then it needs to die as well. So yeah, it's just a very interesting kind of tail end of this episode where we're really starting to see how Captain Luthor basically manipulated Sam Lane so badly to where anybody who is wearing a cape and cowl needs to just be killed off. Even to the point of even going to the extremes of creating kryptonite bullets so Superman could get killed off as well. Very much an interesting episode. Really, it'll be very interesting what Superman has to say to Lois about Sam, who is basically coming up with kryptonite weaponry for him. It'll be kind of interesting to see these arguments in the next episodes. But with that said, I think that's all that I had to say about this episode. And plus, I'm going to try to get out here to get this episode wrapped up. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.